Welcome back to Real Clear Radio Hour, brought to you by the Competitive Enterprise Institute. I'm your host, Bill Frezza. For the second half of our show, we're pleased to have Associate Professor of Political Science John McAdams from Marquette University, who teaches courses in American politics and public policy. As the author of the book JFK Assassination Logic, How to Think About Claims of Conspiracy, he's earned himself a reputation as a comprehensive debunker, while his Marquette Warrior blog seems to have earned him the ire of Marquette's liberal faculty members. Professor, welcome to the show.
Oh, good to be here.
Professor, I asked you on not so much to rehash the controversy over your suspension, although we'll review that, but I want to talk about the wider issue of free speech on campus and the maintenance of intellectual diversity in the face of what appears to be more aggressive Title IX regulation. Now, you're a conservative political science professor. How unusual is that?
Somewhat unusual. Political science is not as badly unbalanced as some other disciplines. For example, it's not as lopsided as sociology. Mm-hmm. It's not nearly as politically correct as humanities departments like philosophy or English. It clearly leans liberal. It doesn't particularly lean politically correct. In that sense, we're maybe a little more like economics than we are like, say, sociology.
So you didn't find your conservatism a barrier to your career?
Actually, it hasn't been, although, remember, I came to Marquette in 1977. It might very well be a barrier now to someone's career, again, depending on their discipline. I know a student, for example, who's a gay libertarian. Mm-hmm. He's in the closet as a libertarian. He's out as gay, but he's in the closet as a libertarian.
Oh, I have a lot of friends in the closet about being libertarians in the tech industry.
Yeah, and he's convinced he better be quiet about his libertarianism, or it might have bad consequences for him.
Well, you know, your right to speak your mind as a professor is supposedly protected by tenure. What did you do to get yourself kicked off campus?
I did a blog post. I had a student who came to me and told me about an exchange with a philosophy instructor after class. Mm-hmm. In class, the instructor had just mentioned gay marriage and basically made a comment sort of implying, well, she's in favor of gay marriage. Isn't pretty much everybody in favor of gay marriage? Well, after class, the student who's opposed to gay marriage confronted her and said he wanted to discuss gay marriage. Mm-hmm. Now, at this point, if she just said, well, I didn't think it would be a good use of class time, no harm, no foul. She has a right to decide how class time will be used, except she didn't say that. She said, you don't have a right to make racist, sexist, and homophobic comments.
And now, is that true?
That's what she said,
okay.
Yes.
No. Is it true that the students don't have a right to make racist, sexist, and homophobic comments? Is she correct in that assertion?
Well, first of all, the problem is her assumption that opposing gay marriage would be homophobic.
Yeah.
So the question is whether you're talking about really racist or sexist or homophobic comments or just what's called racist, sexist, and homophobic. Homophobia is a absurdly loosely used term. People in the proper context in academia would certainly have the right to say that, for example, homosexual orientation is disordered. But again, the key thing would be proper context, not just throwing that in as a slur, but if the discussion is about sexual morality, bringing up the Catholic position on homosexuality would be fair enough.
Okay.
As for sexism, there's plenty of evidence that men and women are different, indeed are psychologically wired differently. By the way, none of that means that men are somehow superior to women. Men and women are just different, but people would have a right to discuss that. But the whole point is the student hadn't said anything homophobic. He just said that he wanted to oppose gay marriage.
Well, how did you get in trouble?
Because I blogged about it. The student came to me, told me the story. He had a recording of that after-class conversation, and using the recording as a source, because it was ironclad accurate, I blogged about it, okay? For a while, some conservative outlets picked it up, and Marquette was on the defensive. Then some academic leftists, including some philosophy professors at other universities, picked it up and started attacking me. So a lot of people started attacking me. First of all, because the instructor was a graduate student, and they said, well, it's unfair to pick on a graduate student. But of course, she was the instructor of record in the course. It was her course entirely. She ran the course She made out the syllabus. She had conducted the classes. She did the grades. From the student standpoint, she was the professor. It's also the case that after it went national, she started getting some pretty nasty emails. And, of course, the university somehow blamed me for that, not the people sending the emails. And as I'm sure you probably know, anybody who gets involved in any kind of controversial situation is going to get some nasty emails.
Internet witch hunts can be pretty ugly on Twitter and email.
I've gotten tons of nasty emails.
So subsequently, you got a Dear John letter announcing that the university is seeking to revoke your tenure and dismiss you from the faculty.
That's correct.
Isn't the whole point of tenure to protect professors who profess politically unpopular views?
Yes, that is, in fact, the whole point, but Marquette doesn't seem to understand that.
The letter accuses you of creating a climate of fear amongst the faculty, and it looks like they've been keeping a dossier on you for some time. What are they afraid of?
Well, I have made enemies by blogging. Whenever I see an abuse at Marquette, I will often blog about it. When a professor says something outrageously biased in class, or for example, I've blogged about professors who tried to shut up students who were saying politically incorrect things. In one case, a philosophy professor, a lot of this is around the philosophy department because philosophy is a very politically correct discipline. The professor was talking about the evils of racial profiling, and the student raised his hand and wanted to talk about the cop's perspective about all this talk of racial profiling. And she tried to shut him up when he was speaking, and then after class demanded that he write a letter of apology to black students in class. She assumed that the black students would be offended at hearing a cop's perspective on racial profiling. Well, I blogged about that. And there are all kinds of things I've blogged about. A seminar called FemSex, which was, I won't give you all the details. Let's just say that mainstream media outlets probably wouldn't want to broadcast the details of this if I gave them explicitly.
If you gave a lecture on the delights of cannibalism or the pleasures of bestiality, would you be protected by tenure?
Oh, I think I probably would, yeah.
And so if you could do that and be protected by tenure, but you can't criticize your fellow professors for political correctness, what's the point of tenure?
That's a good question. Originally, tenure was something that liberals very much liked because alumni in state legislatures were getting on the case of liberal and leftist professors. And still, I've had a fair amount of support from older liberal and leftist professors who, really believe in tenure. But there's a younger generation in academia of people who are politically correct. And one of the things to understand about political correctness is the old-style lefties wanted to debate and discuss their ideas. The new-style politically correct types just want to shut up people who disagree with them.
Deplatform them.
If you say something they disagree with, it must be racist or sexist or homophobic. It must constitute harassment. It must be, it may be offensive. And so they have a whole huge vocabulary for trying to shut up things that they don't like.
What does the American Association of University Professors have to say about Marquette's efforts to fire you?
They haven't said anything yet about Marquette's efforts to fire me. When they suspended me, that is, said, well, you can't teach classes, you can't come on campus, they wrote a rather sharp letter to Marquette saying that Marquette had simply made hash of their own university rules about due process on that. So the AAUP certainly weighed in on that.
Is there an official speech code for professors at Marquette that you can read and consult?
No. There's some very, very vague language that Marquette has about harassment. Something can be harassment if it even merely causes mental discomfort. Right? Now, are students really supposed to get through a college education without ever feeling mental discomfort, like, having their cherished views challenged? The Foundation for Individual Rights in Education gives Marquette's speech code a red light. That is to say, it's one of the worst. So you have that definition of harassment, which is absurdly broad. There's nothing that they call a speech code.
Professor, I want to move on to the students, and particularly whether students are banned from expressing certain types of opinions on campus. reading over the Department of Education and Justice National Blueprint for Campus Speech Codes, it appears that Title IX overrides any free speech protections provided by the First Amendment to the Constitution. How do they justify that?
Well, again, the left has a whole vocabulary for shutting up speech they don't like. For example, it might be called harassment. Marquette, last year in the fall, had every employee of Marquette take a training course, an online training course about harassment. The actual law on harassment is reasonable and limited. For something to be harassing, it must be directed at a protected category. It must be offensive to a reasonable person in that category under that situation. It must be unwelcomed, and it must be severe or pervasive. Except this training program, and of course I blogged about this. That's another way I've made enemies on campus, particularly among the administration. I blogged about this, and the training program we were subjected to basically just said, shut up, don't say anything controversial. It said that a professor having an anti-war poster in his office could be harassment, harassing students on the basis of veteran status.
What about students? Are they free to express their opinions, or can they also be accused of violating speech codes?
Well, of course they can be accused of harassment, most certainly. Examples of students being disciplined for so-called harassment at Marquette I haven't heard of. I've heard of various examples which I've blogged about, attempts to shut up students in class or demeaning students in class for saying a particular thing. I had one student, for example, who had an English professor going on about how many blacks are incarcerated and how terrible that is. She'd worked for the district attorney's office. She spoke up and said, but don't blacks commit more crimes? And the professor said, no, it's all racist police. And then he added, you're part of the problem. So there are lots of examples like that of attempts to suppress certain to demean or deride certain viewpoints.
Under Title IX, what specific identity groups are singled out for protection from hearing opinions that might offend them?
Oh, lots and lots. Race, sex, religion, sexual orientation, handicap status, veteran status, a lot of different groups.
How does a group qualify and register as an identity group deserving of protection from unwanted opinions?
Well, it has to be in the law. It has to be in statutes.
Oh, so this is actually in statute?
Oh, sure. Yes. Let me point out that if we're talking about real harassment, it's fair enough that it be punished. Unfortunately, harassment gets to be defined as just things people disagree with. In that training course that all Marquette employees were subjected to, it gave an example of two employees, both of whom talked to each other about how they oppose gay marriage. There's another fellow who overhears that and objects to that, and we're told in the training course that, yes, those women are guilty of harassment simply for discussing how they oppose gay marriage.
I'm sitting here saying wow to myself, but I don't know where to go with this.
That's the appropriate response. Yeah, wow. In other words, just a disagreement about a political issue in the training course Marquette imposed on its employees was defined as harassment.
So if a group of students are surreptitiously overheard expressing banned opinions by a third party and are reported to the Title IX office, they can be investigated?
In theory, yes. When this whole harassment training went public due to my blog post, Marquette's Chief Flack, the spokesperson, said, well, this course doesn't necessarily reflect Marquette's policies. But of course, if it doesn't necessarily reflect Marquette's policies, why in the world did they impose it on people? So they're saying, hey, we might not punish people for expressing political opinion that's politically incorrect, but we won't say
what they are or when we might do it. How have the students been relating to all this?
The students, probably most of them just kind of keep their head down. The student that started this whole current brouhaha by challenging an instructor after class is very much the exception. Students mostly just sort of keep quiet. They go along with what the instructor wants and just try to get through college with the reasonable grades.
So there's been no pushback, no protests against this. They just sort of toe the line.
Well, Actually, yes, some students did stage a protest on my behalf, and there was an online petition on my behalf, too. So some students will push back. It's only a minority that'll put their heads up, however.
So, Professor, what are you doing to defend yourself, and do you have hopes of getting your job back?
Oh, I think I'll get my job back one way or another. Number one, there is some due process within the university. There's a faculty hearing committee that can hear this whole case and will. This will stretch over many weeks, maybe a matter of months. Then it can make a recommendation to the university president. The university president doesn't have to pay attention to the recommendation, but he would look bad if he doesn't. Then, of course, it can go into court because Marquette, in the contracts that faculty get, Marquette's university statutes are referenced. And those statutes guarantee academic freedom. They said faculty are free to express themselves and engage in political activities, etc. So what's in the contract is legally enforceable. I have very good lawyers, an operation called the Wisconsin Institute for Law and Liberty. And so who knows how far this gets, but it'll be weeks or months, and yes, it can be appealed within the university, and yes, it can go to the courts.
What advice do you have for professors on other campuses who might live in fear of political correctness?
I wish I could, honestly say you really ought to be outspoken, because if enough people are outspoken, they can't shut everybody up. The problem is there is often a price to be paid for being outspoken, for speaking up. I've gotten only one faculty member at Marquette has publicly defended me. He's an old lefty type who's long spoken out in favor of abortion and gay marriage. His name's Dan McGuire. Marquette has protected his academic freedom to take positions radically at odds with the Catholic Church's position, and the guy's consistent. He's defended me. I've gotten lots of emails from other faculty, usually conservative-leaning faculty, that have said, well, we're on your side, but they don't want to speak out publicly. It's true that if enough people will speak out and particularly make an issue of things, be willing to publicize abuses, be willing to go to court. Yes, they can make life difficult for institutions that try to suppress speech. Certainly the Foundation for Individual Rights and Education, everybody listening really needs to look at their website, is a huge resource anytime a university tries to suppress speech, either on the part of a student or on the part of a faculty member. The Foundation for Individual Rights and Education needs to know about it. They will take up the cudgels to protect academic freedom, and often, not always, but often they win. We've
had them on the show. They're quite an interesting and very consistent group of people. Professor, you've been teaching for a very long time. You've seen a lot of changes in academia over your years. Why do you think our key cultural institutions, not just universities, but the media, Hollywood, the arts, why do you think they're so dominated by left liberal perspectives?
I think it's a large degree of self-selection. I think people who are conservative and pro-business tend to go into business. They basically want to do their business. They pretty much want to be left alone. They join their churches, they do good works and give to charity. But people who want to change the world and remold it in their image find journalism, find making documentary films, find being in academia very much to their liking. And it's also the case that the 60s generation marked a real break on the political left. All of a sudden, Herbert Marcuse was popular, the guy who said, tolerating speech is repressive. And so what we have is the actual children of the 60s generation are now old and mostly retired, but the grandchildren of the 60s generation, academics socialized in graduate schools by the 60s generation types, have now become very important in academia, dominating particularly humanities departments, particularly the English departments, philosophy departments, victim studies departments, sociology departments. So what we've had is the 60s radicalism over a couple of generations coming to dominate certain sectors of academia.
At any point, do you see the pendulum swinging back in the other direction?
It's hard to see how that would happen because it's self-reinforcing. The more academia becomes intolerant of libertarian and conservative perspectives, the more libertarians and conservatives will decide, oh, that place is not for me. Now, among students, the pendulum swings both ways. Marquette students are not particularly leftist. Mm-hmm. Depending on how you analyze the numbers, the majority, again, the numbers aren't necessarily easy to analyze, but a majority may well have voted for Scott Walker in the last gubernatorial election. Mm-hmm. If it wasn't a majority, it was like a 48% minority or something. So the students go through college, doing the best they can, getting the credentials they need. So you can have a lefty faculty without necessarily having, everybody in college turned into a lefty. But it's hard to see how this whole thing would be reversed. Parents wanting to send their kids to college really ought to look carefully at the kinds of college they're sending their kids to. Really ought to look carefully at the culture. For example, Catholics who are devout Catholics need to look at websites like the Cardinal Newman, I think it's Institute or Foundation, have a website of Catholic colleges that are really loyal. There is a journal called First Things, that rates colleges and universities according to the religious climate on campus. They rate both Catholic and Protestant. They're ecumenical, both Catholic and Protestant institutions. Even people who aren't particularly religious, but maybe lean libertarian, would probably find the average religious institution more congenial than a lot of left-leaning secular institutions. Just because you're religious doesn't necessarily mean you're intolerant of atheists or agnostics or people who have different religious views. So parents really, really need to be careful consumers. The only force I can see that might check this somewhat is if parents simply take an active role in deciding, well, what college do I want to send my kid to? Is it a place where a kid with libertarian views or religious views will face a hostile environment?
What can an ordinary citizen do? We watch these controversies blow through the press. For folks who believe in intellectual diversity, not necessarily taking one position or another, but believe college campuses should be places where a wide range of views are expressed and debated, what can those people do to change things?
Well, number one, if they contribute to this or that university, they should be a little bit selective. If their alma mater starts suppressing speech, they should stop contributing.
Yeah.
If we're talking about people with a fair amount of money, the truth is nobody should just give money to a university. The bureaucrats running universities, they'll blow it on bureaucratic bloat or something.
Now, that's really going to get you in trouble with the administration.
Yeah, exactly. Now, the key thing is people with some money, to spend and want to contribute to a university should look for particular programs they want to support, maybe particular student organizations they want to support, maybe particular academics whose research they want to support, and target their support there. Just giving money to a university is either going to subsidize political correctness or administrative bloat, but people who contribute can target their money to activities that will add to intellectual diversity.
Well, Professor, thanks so much for sharing your views and good luck with your fight ahead.
Thank you much. I enjoyed being here.
That was Professor John McAdams from Marquette University here on Real Clear Radio Hour, brought to you by the Competitive Enterprise Institute. I'm your host, Bill Frezza. Real Clear Radio Hour is produced in conjunction with Real Clear Politics, America's premier independent political website. If you'd like to hear more, stop by realclearradio.org to sign up for updates on our weekly broadcasts or access podcasts of our past programs. That wraps up our show for this week. Join us next week, same time, same station. See you then.